Welcome to Tommy Solo's Famous Friends. This is where I get to chat with people I've connected with over the years in the world of arts and entertainment. And today I'm very happy to have with me music journalist, broadcaster, and author Aaron Badgley. Welcome to the show, Aaron.
Hi, hey, hi. Thanks for having me on. This is quite an honor. And looking at the people you've interviewed, I am quite honored to be here.
Welcome to the club, and I'm very happy to have you. So, Aaron, I know you have a brand new book. It is Dark Horse Records, the George Harrison, basically after the Beatles, his record company. Editor's note, the actual title of Aaron's new book is Dark Horse, the story of George Harrison's post-Beatles record label. Now, back to the show. So we'll
Yep.
talk about that, but there's a lot more to Aaron Badgley than just this book. So I want to know, as a music journalist and broadcaster, what got you interested in the business and how did you get into radio all those years ago to begin with?
So you just did a George Harrison song. Nice one. All those years ago. You know what? I grew up around music and back in the 70s and back in the pre-internet days, to read about the bands you liked and to understand what was going on, you had to go to the magazines. You had to go to the Crawdaddies, the Rolling Stone, Cream. If you were lucky, you could get Melody Maker, RPM, which was the Canadian Billboard. And I used to go to a record store in Oshawa called Wilson and Lee, and they had all these magazines along with records. And I just devoured each and every magazine. And then I became a member of Wings Fun Club, and I used to get those monthly. Well, they weren't monthly. I guess they were quarterly newspapers from Paul McCartney and Wings. I just love music and I like talking about music. I can't play. I come from a very musical family. I have brothers who play music. One brother performs to this day, but I could write about it. And I got to the bug of writing. I read a book called The Beatles Illustrated Record, which I think every Beatle fan owns. Back in 74, it was kind of the Bible for a long time. And I thought, that's what I want to do. This is a great book. And I think I've gone through three copies. And then I went through three copies of Altogether Now, which is another story because that's like an iconic Beatle book that the author of which actually interviewed me. And I kept going, this is wrong. I should be interviewing you. Yes. This is so wrong, Wally. But anyways, so I spent the first year of my life in hospital and I had a nurse who was from Barbados and I met her when I was like 18. And she said, you don't know this, but I used to walk around with you. I used to bring in tapes. They would send me from Barbados, ska and calypso. And she'd play this reel to reel at a nursing station and she would sit with me all the time. She goes, I'm not surprised you're in radio because you love music from the day you were born. So here I am.
Wow. Wow, that's quite the story. Oh, man. I had a son who was born at 25 weeks gestational, and
Yeah.
so I have a pretty good understanding of how your life started out. That said, radio, what got you into radio? What was the path that took you there?
I loved radio. I'm that generation. We were the ones with the transistor radios to our ears under the covers at night. And radio was this really cool thing. And back in those days, I sound like I'm 100 years old, but back in the 70s, living in Whitby, you'd get these skips. So sometimes we get Chicago, sometimes we get Nashville, sometimes we get all these different stations from the States and Canada. I just fell in love with the whole notion that the disc jockey, and of course, I was a big fan of 1050 Chum, and listened to that with my mom in the morning. And it just, I love the sound. So when I became a teenager, I literally failed math in high school more times than I can count because I failed math. I can't count. And really, the guidance counselor at the time said you have two choices: factory work or maybe doing something in the arts because you're not completely inept there. So I went with the arts and I went to Centennial College. But the funny thing is, I went in as film and TV. I was going to become the great Canadian director. I had all these ideas for movies, but then I got into radio. I just thought, and as my teacher Don Graywood said, "You've got the face for radio, buddy." So
Not quite ready for prime time, but yeah, polish up your vocal chops.
exactly. But I mean, there was a time when radio really meant something and you could make or break an artist. And I really loved the whole idea behind radio and I listened to it night and day. I mean, I would always have the radio on. I still do. It drives my wife nuts, except now I can access stations from Ireland or Scotland, or sometimes I listen to this great station from Germany. She's like, why can we just have quiet? Nope.
That's interesting. The internet has really changed all aspects of the entertainment industry.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. I mean, it's really changed all aspects. And we've got other options now available, like podcasting and so on.
Yep.
So I know that it didn't take you long before you moved up the ladder in radio. You were 19 when you started, and by 20, you were a production manager for a series of stations. So, what exactly does a production manager do in radio?
Well, I don't know what they do these days, but back then we did all the production for commercials, specialty radio shows. We made sure that the records got on the air. We did the charts, we did the playlists, we did every Friday was new music listening meeting with the station owner and what are we going to play and what aren't we going to play. So all that stuff, writing commercials. My first rock and roll production though, or foray into music was I did a special on the Spoons and they had just released their second album and they were playing Oshawa and they interviewed them. I put together an hour special. I thought it was the coolest thing since sliced bread that I got to do. I was John Peel for like 4 minutes. And that got me hooked on doing production. And that's what got me the full-time gig was that and the station manager liked what I did. I mean, I didn't think it was anything special, but there you go. And then I moved around stations and just kept learning and then I started doing sound for my brother's bands and other bands in Durham region, sometimes in Peterborough, because he went to school there, you see. So I had to go and visit him and oh, can you do the sound tonight? Sure. I was really lucky that I was at a time when you didn't need, I don't know what it's like today, but I don't think I could move up that quickly in 2024. And this was in the early 80s. And lots of things there was a willingness to try and experiment back then that I don't think exists today. And you would know that too, right? Like when you listen to radio, like you don't have the same kind of diversity on the radio. Though I remember listening to 1050 Chum, and you might hear Buddy Holly and then the Bee Gees. It was all over the place, and I love that. But that's changed, right? So I don't know. I was lucky, just lucky. As Bing Crosby said, "Call me lucky."
That's interesting. I'm actually a few years older than you are, and I often reminisce about the old days of AM radio when, as you kind of alluded to, 1 minute you'd be listening to Fleetwood Mac, and then it
Yeah,
would be Deep Purple right after, and then over to the Eagles. So it
yeah,
was a much more diverse palette of music back in those days, and everything really is kind of pigeonholed into one category or another now. That said, I know that there's a lot of factors that led up to this new book.
Mhm.
I suppose one is your fascination with the Beatles from a young age. And I know that you had a syndicated radio show all about the Beatles. Tell us
I
about that.
did for 6 years. It was called Beatles Universe. And what I wanted to do in that show, and I worked with a guy named Eric Walker here in the city, and I used to say he's my George Martin because he made me sound good. I, we had a running gag. I would record my vocals. I'd say, okay, we'll take all the Alfred Hitchcock bits out because, so he made me sound reasonably intelligent. But the idea was to say to people, you know the hits, so we'll play a couple of the hits, but you might not know this song by Ringo Starr, or you might not know this by Paul McCartney. You might not even know that Paul McCartney's on this Roy Harper album. You might not know that that's George playing acoustic guitar with Jeff Healey, or you might. So I just really wanted to kind of open up the Beatles universe. And part of that was playing stuff on their respective labels. They owned Apple, Harrison owned Dark Horse, and Ringo had Ringo Records.
And we'll be right back after this.
I'll never forget. I got an email once from an artist on Ringo Records, and he wrote, "Did you actually play my song on your radio?" Yeah, I did. And he's like, "Oh, thank you. You're the first person." This was like 20 years after it had been released, maybe more. I get kind of fixated with this whole notion that a friend of mine said, "Well, Paul McCartney hasn't done anything really good since what? Wings Over America." And you're going, "No, Paul McCartney's done a lot of good stuff. So has Harrison, Ringo." Whether you choose to listen to it, that's up to you. And so what I would do is I would mix the hits with the obscure. So I even played Pete Best, his solo records. I'm in for the deep dive. And that's what I do kind of with my show that I currently have is that I try to play a lot of diversity, play music that you might not hear on other radio stations. And it was a fascination to me. So that's a long answer. But there's a lot of good music that's associated with the Beatles that people may not know. So and Eric was the greatest because he'd say, yeah, I don't know if we want to play this 12-minute raga. And I went, well, it's so he'd calm me down a bit, but
Well, that's
it was
interesting. Wow. you're currently at CFRU in Guelph. Now that's campus radio, am I
It
right?
is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I envy those of you in the radio industry who can pick and choose what you play. And I know it used to be a lot more like that. God, even as recent as I think 2010, I remember walking into a Moose FM radio station in North Bay and
Yeah.
handing them a CD. I was on rotation on the Moose FM family of radio
Nice.
stations for about 2 years.
That's
And
awesome.
it was 2015 that we recorded the Introducing the Night Crew album. And I reached out and they said, well, now everything's corporate out of Vancouver. And I couldn't even get my foot in the door. So this is why I appreciate people like you, because now with campus radio, if I send you something and you like it, you can make the choice. It doesn't have to go up the channels and to corporate somewhere. So that's enviable. Now back to the book.
Hmm.
There's a lot of interesting facts in there. And there's obviously, because it's George Harrison, there's a lot of people associated with the Dark Horse records. But from what I understand from reading your book, this kind of was like the phoenix rising from the ashes of Apple. Would that be accurate?
So what? Yeah, 100%. Harrison and Starr actually wanted to keep Apple going, but by 73, there was a lot of lawsuits with Alan Klein. It was a mess. Apple had become a real, what is the line in the Ruddles? It was a golden age for lawyers. So Harrison and Starr thought, look, we'll buy John and Paul out and we'll start from scratch and we'll keep Apple. The reason was he had a group called Splinter that he really liked, and he liked a song called Lonely Man, and he wanted to release it as a single on Apple, but Apple, as I said, was collapsing. So he got advice and said, well, why don't I start my own label? Leon Russell, who was a good friend of his, had a record label called Shelter Records. And he said, look, George, just, do your own thing. So Harrison did. And he struck a deal with A&M Records. Now, the thing was that Harrison was still signed to Capitol. So Harrison couldn't put his own stuff out on Dark Horse until after 75, which he did in 76. But he signed Splinter, and then he signed, of course, his good friend Ravi Shankar. And what amazed me when doing the research of the book, I talked to a member of Splinter that in 74 and 73, he spent 18 months working on the first Splinter album. He played multiple instruments. He produced it. He produced and was on the Ravi Shankar album. He produced and recorded Living in the Material World. Then he did Dark Horse. Then he did the tour. I mean, this guy really worked. And he didn't, as the guy from Splinter, Bill Elliott, said to me, he goes, he didn't shaft us. He didn't say, like, I'm really busy. He'd stay up all night working on a mix, and they'd come in the morning. He'd go, oh, you know what? I've done this mix. I'm going to go grab an hour's sleep before I go work on Shankar's album, kind of thing, which is pretty cool. But yeah, it was the phoenix rising from the ashes. And Ringo, of course, formed Ringo Records, which had less success, although a very colorful discography. If you ever want to go down a rabbit hole, check out some of the stuff on Ringo Records. And there was a group on there called Stormer that I think was about 10 years too early. They were pretty good, kind of heavy metal, hard rock. But anyways, I digress.
Yeah, there was an obscure Ringo Starr album that I had, and I'm hard pressed to remember the name of it, but it featured Harry Nilsson and Can't Live Without You. It's like a vampire story
Oh,
on this
Dracula.
album.
Son of Dracula.
Right. Yeah. Was that on Ringo Records?
Good question. It was on Rapple Records, and there was a combination of RCA and Apple Records, so they formed Rapple. So you're
Yeah.
close.
Just reminded me of that album. I had that album, and I played it right through a couple of times, but I was just fascinated by Harry Nilsson's voice. And
Oh,
that guy had a set of pipes like nobody. Ravi Shankar. When I was in grade 9, which would have been 1974, I've always regretted that our social convener arranged for a bus tour to go from my hometown of North Bay to Toronto. I'm not sure where the event was held, but it was the concert for Bangladesh, the Dark Horse thing. So I always regretted not having been able to go to that. But can you imagine? That must have been just something for people to see.
well, I'll tell you something. I didn't put this in the book. Is that in 74, I was 10, and Harrison and Ravi were playing Maple Leaf Gardens. They did two shows. It was in December. They were doing one in the afternoon, one at night. So I skipped off school, and I had saved money for months because I was working then. Long story, but I was working and I had money. So I hopped a bus and I skipped school. The school called my mother and said, where's Aaron? So she put two and two together. And as I got off the bus in Toronto, my brother was there to meet me. All he said was, Mom's really upset. And I said, look, I don't care what the consequences. Let me just go see Harrison. I don't care if I never see the light of day again. I just want to see. I didn't get to see George. So you and I share that. Like you pass it, you think, well, maybe next time. And there was never another time, which is a real shame. But that close to seeing him, Tommy.
Yeah,
That
no,
close.
I just didn't have the money, and I had a paper route, but I didn't have enough money for the tickets to this thing. But I've always regretted it. I did see Paul McCartney live, and it was at the Sky Dome, and it was while Linda was still in the band in Wings, and it was really good. But I'll never forget how loud the bass was. Man, it was just punching me right in the gut, and we were about 10th row back. But
Wow.
anytime you had any connection with the Beatles, I mean, there's electricity in the air. I mean,
Yeah.
I watched their debut on the Ed Sullivan Show, and I was mesmerized. And before that, I really didn't have that much interest in music because there just wasn't anything out there that really hit me. But I think there was some sort of a magneto hypno beam or something that was coming out of that Ed Sullivan Show that hit all of us young boys and girls, that just made us all want to grab a guitar or a set of drumsticks. So I get where the fascination for the Beatles comes from. I've had it my entire life. And we'll be right back after this.
During that Ed Sullivan Show, during that broadcast was the only time in New York City's history where there was not one crime committed.
I'd heard that before. Wow, yeah. Isn't
Can you
that
believe that? Even the criminals took an hour off to watch the people.
wow. Wow. Oh man. Oh God. So Dark Horse Records had a fair run, I guess, and you started to allude to the fact that George needed to shop the label for distribution, and he had some help from Leon Russell. Ultimately, they ended up going with A&M. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, because A&M, people don't realize this, is that A&M was an artist label because A&M is Herb Alpert, he's the A, and Jerry Moss, who was a songwriter, was the M. These guys were really very artist focused. And if you look at what was on A&M in the 70s, you had a lot of really cool music that came out that, other labels weren't really willing to touch. They were very artist friendly, but I interviewed a gentleman who was in charge of doing the promotion for Dark Horse through A&M. He said, look, the truth was they wanted a Beatle. I mean, everyone knew the contracts were coming up in 75. And every label, it was a big feather in the cap to have a Beatle on your label back then. Because 74, keep in mind that up to 74, the solo Beatles were huge. McCartney, Red Rose Speedway, My Love, #1, Ringo, Photograph, Year 16, Oh My, John Lennon, Imagine. I mean, these guys were still turning out the hits. And George, My Sweet Lord, Give Me Love, Give Me Peace on Earth, What Is Life, Bangladesh. So A&M thought, if we pick up Dark Horse, he'll eventually go on Dark Horse and we'll eventually have a Beatle. But that didn't happen the way that they had hoped. And then once Harrison had made the decision to sign with Warner Brothers, it was game over from A&M. They just said, you know what? We're done here. And they sued, breach of contract, all this. It just got really ugly. But as you say, it persevered, and Harrison had a very viable label for a few years there that brought a lot of good music into the world. Splinter, he got the Stair Steps to get back together again. Of course, Ooh Child. Henry McCulloch, the guitarist from Wings, who signed a solo deal with George. So there was an interesting label, and there was some good music on there, and I stand by it.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned George Harrison's single, What Is Love? That was produced by Phil Spector, wasn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
Now, that's interesting. And I'm trying to think, that was Dark Horse Records or was it
No, that was Apple.
Apple? Okay.
Yeah. His biggest hits were on Apple. When he hit Dark Horse, his biggest hits happened in the 80s, such as Got My Mindset on You, When We Was Fab, all those years ago. But like in the 70s, his big hits were all on Apple. Because again, the Beatles was tied to Capitol Records, EMI, and Apple was signed to EMI. To me, it's a fascinating story of record label. I'm also very fascinated by record labels, which really bores the hell out of my poor wife. It's like, and then they changed the design. If you look at the Canadian apple versus the American apple, it's like, oh, Aaron, quiet.
It is interesting how the men in suits or the guys in suits come up with these different ideas for distribution in different countries. And there are
Yeah.
certain album covers. I know there was one Beatles album, I'm trying to remember which one it was, that they changed the cover. The original album was dolls, I think, that
Yeah.
were
The butcher cover. The
the
butcher
butcher
cover.
cover. Yeah, yeah.
Yesterday and today. Yeah.
So it's interesting how people come up with these ideas that either work or aren't going to work. And I get where you would be intrigued by that because there's a lot out there and a lot of differences with releases internationally. Okay, so the book is out. It's Dark Horse, the story of George Harrison's post-Beatles record label. And who is the publisher?
Sonic Bound, which is a company out of England who just publishes books about music. And they're quite a cool company. They just put out some interesting books about classic albums. But yeah, I work with them in England. They were great. They are great. I shouldn't say they were. I'm working with them on my current projects, and they're a fantastic publishing company. They're very hands off until I mean, some of the stuff they were very hands on, where they're saying, well, I don't know if people really need to know the difference in promo copies in America versus Canada. Why not? But, they've been an absolute delight in the bookstores. The big news I just got in the past couple of weeks is that the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame has put it in their archives and in their library in their bookstore, which I didn't expect. Some guy from Whitby who could barely get through school has a book in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I'm really just knocked out. So
Wow. I'd ask you how many copies it sold, but I know you can't count, so we won't go there.
yeah, you don't even. When I was a social worker, right, my boss would come and go, "Did you do the budget, Aaron?" Yeah, I did. Yeah.
There's a few things we need to talk about. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
That said, where can people get a copy of the new book?
Anywhere you buy books, if it's not in stock, they'll order for you. You can get it on Amazon, Indigo. If you're in the States, it's Barnes and Noble, Walmart has it. It's everywhere. I've been very lucky to have good distribution on the book. On September the 29th, I'm going to be in Toronto at Word on the Street. I'll be selling and autographing copies if people want to stop by and see me talk with a couple of other really cool authors, Canadian authors. Yeah, it's available everywhere where fine books are sold. So yeah, it's easy to get. Should be. If not, give me a call.
All right. Very nice. Well, congratulations on the new book, and we'll look forward to everything that's coming. So, speaking of that, what's next for you, Aaron?
Well, I'm working on two books right now. One is a book on a Canadian band called Klaatu. There's no book on Klaatu, and I've been very fortunate to talk to a couple of members, and I've got access to pretty cool stuff. So I'm doing a book about Klaatu because that to me is a fascinating story. And then I'm doing a book on Ringo Starr strictly in the 70s, from January 1st, 1970, right up to December 31st, 1979. And I'm working on that. I got some cool interviews lined up about that. So those two things I'm in progress. I'm not moving too quickly these days, but they're both fast. You know what happens, Tommy? You start doing the research and you just start going down these rabbit holes. But
Oh, well,
and the funny thing is the Klaatu and the Ringo book are actually linked because of Ringo Starr Good Day Vienna album. He appeared on the front cover as the character Klaatu from the film The Day the Earth Stood Still. And of course, Klaatu got their name from that film, and that's part of where the rumors started that the Klaatu were actually the Beatles. And that's a fascinating time in history.
absolutely. Well, this is all interesting and good stuff, and we're all going to be looking forward to the new material that's coming from you, Aaron. I want to thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to do this with me today.
Thanks for having me on. This has been a treat. You're great to talk with. Thanks a lot.
Well, I appreciate it. Until next time, cheers. Tommy Solo's Famous Friends is a one-man production, meaning that I've done all the work, including recording, editing, guest acquisition, etc. Don't forget to look for the accompanying articles based on these interviews at 519magazine.com. The theme song for Tommy Solo's Famous Friends is a clip from my original composition, The Burn, all rights reserved. If you enjoy the show and you'd like to help us keep it going, why don't you click on the Buy Me a Coffee link in the show notes. Hit the like button, subscribe, all that stuff. We really appreciate it. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram. And until next time, cheers.